If you've ever walked away from a table, or had someone walk away from yours, chances are it was for reasons related to one of these 5 things. If your reason didn't make my list, then let me know in the comments. After taking a quick poll on the subject to see how influential these different things were, I think you'll be a little surprised with the results, because I know I certainly was. Because the 5th most likely reason of those that stood out to me was not being willing to admit when you're wrong. Maybe it's just because I've been married for a long time, but for me personally, I think that this is one of the pet peeves that seems to be ubiquitous throughout pretty much every part of everybody's life. And it's the kind of thing that really gets on people's nerves and sticks with you. Because the temptation as a dungeon master to think that because you are the space where the buck stops, that you are not allowed to ever make mistakes, or that anything that you say goes regardless of whether or not it's actually factual, is a temptation that a lot of dungeon masters fall into, and is a really nasty problem for anybody who's ever had to sit in on those kinds of tables. A toxic unwillingness to admit that you have made a mistake at the table leads to a table full of people who are on edge and uncertain as to how to move forward as they're dealing with your crap. I've been at these kinds of tables before, and it is increasingly frustrating, and I'm a pretty non-confrontational guy, but there were definitely people at the table, Reed, my wife, who were far more willing to let people know that they were wrong and fight it out, and nobody wants to sit through that. But nevertheless, only 7% of people who have responded to my little poll walked away from a table because of this specific reason. Clocking in at our 4th most likely reason for people to walk away was rules restrictions. And there's some really specific subsets of rules restrictions that are actually the reason why people get up and walk. Because it's not actually a bad thing to put restraints on your game and to only limit sources to certain places, or to restrict people from certain classes or races, or just choices in general, because you're trying to improve your game and make the little adjustments that make the game run the way that you feel it should. It's totally okay, and in fact pretty much encouraged, to run every tabletop role-playing game the way it runs best for your particular group, after all. And so a certain number of rules restrictions are to be expected. But what causes problems at the table is when rules restrictions are either hyper-restrictive or are completely arbitrary. If your table rules are too restrictive, you run the risk of getting people to feel like they don't have choices that should be a part of the game. It's alright to restrict a couple of things here or there if you've got a solid reason behind it, but if you restrict people from being able to have the options that they feel like are available to them, it can start to feel like, why should I bother playing this game when it's not even going to be the game that I thought I was playing? Similarly, if your restrictions don't have any reason other than, I don't like this, then you run into a challenge with some players at some tables of not being able to bridge the gap between their expectations and your expectations, as these arbitrary rules cause frustration. And of course, when it comes to rules restrictions, there's a bonus mention to just flat out ignoring any or all rules on fiat at any moment. When we just ignore the rules and place restrictions on people by just having things work the way we think that they should, regardless of what's written in the books, we're basically telling people that they can't know what the world is going to look like until they run it past us and get permission from the DM. And that mother may I feel is not something that most people enjoy, and on top of that, it leads to a lack of understanding as to how the world works that really frustrates people and makes it hard for them to engage. It's one of the reasons why I run my tables primarily as rules as written, so that people know what to expect on how the world works and how the game system interacts with their choices. But again, only 8% of respondents selected rules restrictions as a reason for quitting. The 3rd most common reason for leaving a game is inflexibility, or railroading. This doesn't just mean having a linear plot. Railroading happens when players try to go in different directions because of the hooks that are in the world and the things that interest them, and are forced back on track because the DM isn't able to bend and flex and try to allow these other options. Now, this is not necessarily seen as a bad thing in a new DM who might not actually know yet how to improvise some of those things, but it becomes a problem as more and more experience is gained if we don't allow our players the freedom to try different paths, or if we don't allow things to be resolved in a way that wasn't the way we intended. Some of the respondents cited role-playing inflexibility as being their problem, where they are railroaded down a specific conversational path because the DM only thought that it could be solved in that particular direction and wasn't open to any other ideas. Keeping yourself flexible and being willing to look at things from different people's perspectives is vital in order to run a good game, and being willing to accept the fact that if your party decides to go left when you thought they were going to go right, it's your job to provide some world and something there that will allow them to continue forward, either on that path entirely or twisting slowly back to the linear path that you already had planned towards the future. Coming in at 20% of our respondents in number 2, and leaving for our number 1 a whopping 50% of all the responses, is what I call the wrong hat problem. When we're running a game of Dungeons & Dragons and we consider ourselves the Dungeon Master, we were originally titled in older editions the Referee. And that's because when we're actually running the game, referee is kind of the hat that we're wearing. It's where we adjudicate the rules and how things would work out in the world, and we try to be as fair and impartial as possible about each player's interactions with the world as well as with the monsters and NPCs' interactions with the players. However, there are several other hats that we wear in our lives and in Dungeons & Dragons that can impact our game significantly if we're still wearing them when we get to the table. For instance, perhaps we're instead wearing our designer hat. When we wear the designer hat preparing for a game of Dungeons & Dragons, we tend to get focused in on our story and the lore and the background, the adventures that we have planned, and the bits and pieces that are going to go together in order to get to it. We get lost in our story and our world, and we build things up, and we're in charge of all of it. Our focus is on our story instead of on the player's story, which, if we bring that to the table, can be a huge detriment. And of course, some DMs not only come to the table not wearing the right hat, but perhaps not wearing a hat at all, as they consider themselves one of the group and just sitting there at the table, and their usual preferences and choices come into play. A big problem in that regard is the kind of favoritism that falls in as we cater to our spouse or our best friend to the detriment of the other players at the table. There were a number of respondents talking about how they essentially felt like they were watching a couple play with one another while they sat there on the sidelines not getting the same kind of attention, or in the same situations having their choices and awesome options that they came up with quashed in favor of another player's options that seemed like to them they were on the same vein, but the DM saw it differently because they were biased by who was saying it. Being an impartial referee is vital to being a good dungeon master, and so it's important that we wear the right hat at the right time. But the number one reason that people left games, which has something to do with the number 5 reason, is actually a misunderstanding of the DM relationship. The relationship between a dungeon master and the players is supposed to be one of camaraderie and friendship. We're supposed to be creating an environment of shared collaborative enjoyment and not creating an adversarial situation where we show ourselves to be superior to the players at our table. And that's why an adversarial or superior attitude is the #1 reason why players leave games. Just because the Dungeon Master has a lot more responsibility and is essentially engaging in a hobby instead of a game does not mean that they have more right to be having fun than anybody else. It doesn't mean that their way is the better way in every situation. While it does mean that you are where the buck stops for all final rulings, we need to remember that our role as leaders in these games is one of common consent and need to be able to bend and be diplomatic about our disagreements at the table. We also need to make sure that our players realize that they are valuable and that their contribution is as important as our own. If you've ever tried to Dungeon Master a game and run it for yourself, you will understand exactly how important it is to have other people there at the table. D&D is a collaborative game, and it is a group sport. It is not a solo endeavor as a general rule. And so you can't treat it as if it is, as if you were the most important person and that everybody should get on board with you. If that's an attitude that you've embraced in the past, recognize that half the people who have left groups would leave your group, which is a pretty startling number. Whether you suffer from any of these flaws or not, there's always room for improvement. Check out my after-action DM improvement tool for an easy post-game way to analyze your DMing and push yourself to the next level. Until then, or until next time, thanks for watching. Happy adventuring.